Hello everyone, my name is Shane Misuro and this is my Module 9 case study. The particular event that we were asked to analyze is one that happened in Rocket Junior High School. There were 10 events that happened that are important to establish. First, Richard, a vice principal, called James to his office to follow up on some tardies. James was then sent back to Richards by his teacher, saying that he might have exchanged some drugs with another student, David Ramos. Richard, James, and David met in Richard's office with the school police officer to discuss what had been exchanged. At that point, James said that he had given David something to hold for him. Then, the officer searched David and James and found on David a pair of brass knuckles. James then said that he instructed David not to tell anyone about the brass knuckles after the officer found them. The sixth thing that happened was the arrest of both David and James. They were taken into custody, and Richard then notified James and David's parents, specifically his mother's. James's mother was not concerned with her son spending time in a youth detention center. However, David's mother was extremely concerned with the situation and her son currently found himself in, and the potential consequences that it might have currently and in the future. Richard then refused to file paperwork about the incident because he felt that the school's policy would require David to be unfairly and disproportionately punished for his actions in this incident. Richard's superior called him about a week later and urged him to go through with expelling both David and James, indicating that Richard would be reprimanded if he did not. All of these events happened over one day at Rocket Junior High School. Richard received a call from his superior 1 week after that. In terms of the people involved, Richard Inman was involved. He is a first-year assistant principal that was responsible for the discipline of the two boys. He feels that although James is receiving appropriate punishment, David Ramos is being unjustly and unfairly punished. David Ramos is an honors-level student and skilled musician. His response to being questioned and searched seemed to indicate that he was aware of the severe consequences that might proceed should the brass knuckles be found on him, but said nothing during or after the incident. James is a student who has been frequently disciplined by the administration. When the brass knuckles were found, he voluntarily admitted that they were his, and he also admitted to threatening David to not say anything about the brass knuckles. He explained that he intended to use them after school. James's mother is also involved and is fine with James staying in detention. David's mother is extremely concerned about the situation and the consequences that her son might be subject to. Finally, Rich's superior, who is the director of secondary education, wants Richard to follow procedure and file paperwork that would result in James and David's expulsion. They warned that Richard not doing this would result in official reprimand of Richard, as well as a letter in his personnel file. In terms of the parties harmed by this incident, most directly, both James and David would be harmed. Also, if Richard chooses to follow school procedure and have both boys expelled, then he will incur if Richard chooses to follow school procedure, both boys will be expelled from school and will incur the resulting consequences. If Richard chooses not to follow school procedure, then he will incur negative professional consequences. In terms of the existing law, possession of brass knuckles, which belonged to James but were given to David, is a felony offense, and legal decision-making would conclude in charging both boys with possession of a felony weapon. None of the actions in the incident were discriminatory or constituted harassment. And although the incident originally started with a suspected exchange of drugs, there was illegal contraband exchanged, and so what illegal contraband it was is not necessarily important. Quite simply, if you were to sum up this entire ethical dilemma, it would be as follows. Richard feels that the school's discipline policy on possession of weapons would unfairly and unjustly punish David Ramos. In terms of the people involved here, there were students. David, who was a well-behaved honor student and skilled musician in the school band. James, who was a student who had historically found himself in varying degrees of trouble, but through the effort of Richard was beginning to see improvement. There were also teachers involved. A teacher that reported that he or she saw James give something to David. Both David and James's parents are involved. James's parents are not concerned with the consequences their son is incurring for this incident. However, David's parents are extremely concerned with the incident, that the incident will negatively affect their child currently and in the future. Lastly, there are administrators involved. Richard feels that the school's zero-tolerance policy will unfairly punish David and negatively impact his future. Richard is from the south side of town and therefore empathizes with the socioeconomic circumstances students from that area may be experiencing, such as David and James. Richard's superior warned him to follow the school's policy and file paperwork to proceed with the expulsion of both James and David. All these events occurred at Rocket Junior High School. The school seems to have a diverse body of students who are of varying socioeconomic status. Specifically, students from the south side of town are said to be of lower socioeconomic status. Legal decision-making requires that both students be charged with felony possession of a prohibited weapon on school property, and a zero-tolerance school policy would result in both boys being expelled from their current school and placed instead into the district's disciplinary alternative education program for at least one marking period or 45 days. In terms of the information presented, there will be damage to stakeholders. The situation may be potentially damaging to the community or individual community members if James were allowed to use the brass knuckles in the way he intended to do. The situation may also be damaging to David if the incident goes on his untarnished discipline record. The situation will be damaging to Richard whether or not he chooses to follow paperwork with the expulsion. If he chooses to not act, he will incur disciplinary consequences from his superiors. If he chooses to file the paperwork and expel James and David, he will violate his personal ethics and sense of moral responsibility. The individuals or groups with a stake in the outcomes would be most directly David, James, and Richard. Potential future consequences may be incurred by the school community and greater community that the school is in if instances such as this were allowed to go unpunished, specifically by James. All of those relevant stakeholders have been consulted, and although we don't know more about the specific demographic makeup of the school, as well as more background as to the specific disciplinary records of James, it may be useful in determining the most ethical outcome to the situation. However, that being said, I do feel I have enough information to make a decision. The nature of this decision is very, very simple in this particular case. Either Richard follows procedure and files paperwork to expel both James and David, which is against his moral and ethical framework, or he does not and incurs professional consequences. If Richard chose to file that paperwork, school rules and regulations would be uniformly applied. James would be appropriately punished for his actions, and no professional consequences would be incurred by Richard. However, David would be unfairly and disproportionately punished for his role in the situation, and Richard would violate his sense of moral and ethical obligation to do what is best for all of his students. On the other hand, if Richard didn't file the paperwork, the school rules and regulations would be weakened and shown to be applied unevenly and subjectively. James would go unpunished for his violation of the rules, which could lead to the future poor behavior, and Richard would incur significant professional consequences, including a formal reprimand and letter in his professional personnel file. On the bright side, not filing paperwork would result in David not incurring disproportional disciplinary actions for his role in the situation, and Richard wouldn't violate his sense of moral and ethical obligations to his students. That being said, it seems clear to me that the most ethical and legal decision for Richard is to file paperwork resulting in the expulsion of the two boys in question. This decision is validated by several ethical decision-making frameworks and standards that we have studied in this class. First, the utilitarian standard states that the best approach is what is best for most people when all possible outcomes are considered. Evaluating the dilemma from this standard makes it clear that David is the only one that will be harmed if Richard files paperwork. James would receive the consequences in line with his admitted role in the unethical behavior. Richard would avoid professional consequences, and whoever is at risk in the greater public from James's current or future unethical behavior receives proportional and potential protection because he will be an alternative program. The common good standard also validates my decision. The common good standard states that the ethical decision should strive to protect the well-being of those around them. Evaluating the dilemma from the common good standard again finds that reporting and expelling the boys to be the most just and ethical outcome. There is historical precedent for James's violent behavior, and little doubt that this trend was going to continue outside of school if he was not detained as a result of this event. Fortunately, David was the most recent victim of this unethical behavior, but there's virtually no evidence to suggest that this would be the last if this event went unpunished. In the virtue ethics model, ethical decision-making is evaluated under the question of what would a virtuous person do. In this case, a crime was committed. David, although the victim of intimidation and threats, chose not to report that dangerous materials had been entrusted to him, even when it was clear that he was in the presence of authority figures who had a responsibility to protect him from the potential results of being threatened. David therefore acted dishonestly, and it's virtuous to meet such behaviors with some weighted consequence. Richard does have some reservations about whether the severity of these punishments will disproportionately affect David's future, but this is an opinion and conjecture. It's not fact. He doesn't know how this will affect David's future, if at all. The bottom line is that both boys did do what they were accused of doing, and that it is ethical to apply the appropriate consequences to correct that behavior. The only possible problem with this current situation is the zero-tolerance rule that the district has adopted. Though consequences need to be applied, it is true that in this case, as with many, not all the parties involved are equally responsible. Therefore, the uniform applications of those consequences may not be what is most just, given the weight of personal responsibility of the parties share. What is truly the best outcome for all parties involved is if all of them were punished as the rules state they must be, but Richard is given some leeway into deciding the severity of the punishments based on the unique role and responsibilities of each stakeholder. Unfortunately, this system relies on the notion that those deciding how to discipline will be doled out are moral and ethical themselves, and not subject to political pressures and personal bias. In this particular case, it's unclear whether that bias would affect Richard's discipline making. He has prioritized forming relationships with certain students like James, and that he views to be at risk, and views James's admission that David was innocent as a positive result of this exerted energy. Not only is there no evidence at all that Richard's interventions directly cultivated ethical behavior in James through his admission of guilt, but there is some evidence that this attempts to develop rapport did bias his opinions of resulting guilt and innocence, choosing to identify James's admission as being, at least in part, a result of this relationship. In other words, there's no direct evidence to assume that Richard is biased and therefore would not be able to make a fair and weighted decision, although there is some evidence to suggest that he is in fact biased. If this were to happen and my decision were to be implemented, first, Richard would have to file the paperwork. What might happen or what will happen as a result of that would be that James and David would be shipped off to an alternative setting. James's stay in the alternative setting would be beneficial to him because his particular unethical behaviors and problems could be individually addressed. David would most likely serve the minimum amount of time in that alternative school, about 45 days, due to his lack of past behavioral problems and academic history, and then he would be readmitted to the mainstream educational setting. The boys and their families and the administration and staff of both the alternative school and Rocket Junior High School would need to be notified about this decision. Because this incident was public, there would be no way to privately or individually resolve this with each boy. Also, it's important to remember that steps must be taken to explain to both boys what they did wrong and how the consequences of their current situation can be restored. James has a history of violent and unethical decision making. He needs to use his time in alternative school to find the root and causes of that decision-making pattern and determine what he can do to change that pattern permanently. If he does change that pattern, he will be readmitted to a mainstream education. David should have immediately reported to some person of authority that James gave him a weapon to hold, and he currently should have done it when he and James were both caught. He certainly should have done it when he and James were both caught. He didn't, and that was wrong. If he takes this consequence as a teachable moment and proceeds as he has in the past with his education, his stay in the alternative education school will be brief. Although Richard feels that this event will have negative repercussions on David's future success, it's really unlikely. One negative event such as this in a 15-year-old's life is unlikely to destroy a person permanently. It is overtly simplistic to believe that this is the one thing that will trigger David's downfall, especially when he clearly has the tools and personal support someone would need to recover from such an instance and be successful in the future. In terms of my reflection, this particular case study gave me the ability and opportunity to apply ethical decision-making models and framework to a true-to-life ethical dilemma. I believe this experience will help promote the academic success and personal well-being of my students because it'll give me practice in cultivating and teaching ethical ethics and ethical frameworks to my students, which has been shown to increase student academic success. I think that this experience with moral and ethical frameworks and their applications will help better prepare my students for college, careers, and their future life. They'll help me support every student and their developments. Also, my new and acquired knowledge on ethical frameworks and applicable ethical decision-making processes will inspire staff, the members of the faculty that I work with, to create approaches for improving and promoting school learning that involve these ethical decision-making processes. By analyzing and methodically working through ethical decision-making, I believe that I will influence student achievement by creating challenging and supportive conditions, both ethically, conditions conducive to each of my students' success. I think it'll help construct appropriate organizations and policies and systems by allowing me to know how to ethically apply, methodically and intentionally apply the ethical frameworks and knowledge that I have acquired to potential ethical decisions that might arise and dilemmas that might arise. When reflecting on my past experiences, it's clear that this class, the readings that I've been made to do, as well as their applications, has strengthened my ethical foundation and given me ethical tools that I will need and use in applying when faced with future ethical decisions. Although these tools are not complete and you can always develop more or firmer ethical foundations, I believe that this is an ongoing event and that this class has given me firm foundation on which to develop those schools. It's been a pleasure working with all of you. Have a nice day. Goodbye.